very few people really know who Ulysses S. Grant was.
Today, there is this sense that he's forgotten.
He's been called so many things over the years.
The first modern American warrior.
A bloody butcher. A corrupt president.
A belligerent drunk.
The greatest general of his time.
The unheroic hero of our greatest national epic.
There were but two parties now. Don't forget, we possess strengths they do not have.
That was a look at the three-part miniseries, Grant for History, which chronicles the life of one of the most complex and perhaps underappreciated generals and presidents in U.S. history, Ulysses S. Grant. Joining us now, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and biographer Ron Chernow, and retired United States Army General and former CIA Director David Petraeus. Great to have you both on today.
Ron, let's begin with you. As you go through your book, and I'm sure this miniseries as well, the term unheroic hero seems to come to mind over and over again. Here's a man totally underestimated throughout his entire life. As you wrote, when he showed up in Washington, people were shocked by the lack of sort of a forceful presence. And yet he is a man who did as much as anybody this side of Abraham Lincoln of saving our Union. Tell us how he managed that.
Yeah, Walt Whitman said about Ulysses S. Grant that there was nothing heroic about him, and yet he was the greatest of heroes. Grant had a special type of charisma, which was the total lack of charisma. And people know that he was the victorious Union general in the Civil War. I think the side of the story that they don't know is that Grant's presidency was not just this failed presidency marked by corruption, but that he was our greatest civil rights president between Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon Baines Johnson. He really inherited the mantle of the Civil War after Lincoln was assassinated, and the 4 million freed slaves who had become full-fledged American citizens with the right to vote. It was really Grant who protected them against the violent backlash of the Ku Klux Klan in the South.
Yeah, at the same time, though, he obviously, as you know, was criticized because the promise of Reconstruction did not go the way leaders like Frederick Douglass had hoped it would go. In fact, many were embittered that Grant wasn't aggressive enough. How does history hold him accountable for that? Does it hold him accountable for that, or has history been unfair to Grant in that respect?
No, I think that Grant did everything in his power to see that Reconstruction succeeded. And I should say, Joe, that for a long time, Reconstruction was seen as this big fiasco with illiterate and corrupt legislators, black and white. Now we see it as a noble experiment in biracial justice. We had 2,000 African Americans held state and local offices in the South. We had 14 black members of the House and 2 black members of the Senate. In fact, Ulysses S. Grant personally marched up to Capitol Hill with his entire cabinet to get past the Ku Klux Klan Act, which gave him emergency powers to declare martial law and send federal troops into the South. What happens, Joe, at the end of his second term is that not only is there the violent resistance in the white South, but there's fatigue from Northern liberals as well. So in the last year or two of his second term, Grant has to backtrack from his commitment to Reconstruction. But during the first 5 or 6 years of his presidency, he could not have been a more vigorous supporter of it.
You know, General Petraeus, one of the more remarkable things in reading Ron's book about Grant for me was how Grant was considered a failure by many, even close to him. But that first scene where he's put in charge of a group of guys who were considered misfits, and yet in this short amount of time, he somehow wills them to come together as a fighting unit and actually excel on the battlefield. And that seemed to be Grant's MO time and time again throughout the Civil War. what special leadership skill did he have that separated him from all of Lincoln's other generals?
Well, he had extraordinary competence, Joe. And keep in mind, of course, when Lincoln finally finds his general, as it was described, he had been through most of the other Union generals in getting to Grant, who had proven himself first at the tactical level in the West, then with his extraordinary operational victory at Vicksburg, and then comes east, takes command of the entire Union forces, and crafts the strategy that does indeed save the Union, because it was his strategy, with Sherman taking Atlanta in September of 1864, and then Sheridan taking the valleys, Shenandoah Valley, not long after that, that enabled Lincoln to win the election of November 1864, keeping in mind that he was running against one of Grant's predecessors, General McClellan, who had said he would sue for peace. And we forget that there were draft riots, there was unrest in cities like New York, and it's entirely possible that McClellan could have won had it not been for the successes of the first true strategy for all of the Union forces. But Grant had this indomitable determination. In the series, they have this incredible moment after the terrible first day at Shiloh, where Sherman comes up to Grant and he says, "Well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we?" And Grant says, "Yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And, you know, this was even inspirational to us so many years later in Iraq on very tough days. He could see a battlefield. He could see it in time and in space, and he could issue orders that were very, very clear and would synchronize the activities of all of the different commanders on a battlefield and ultimately in the entire strategy that enabled, again, the Union to win the war and save the Union because it enabled Lincoln to win the election of 1864.
Hey, Ron, it's Willie Geist. In an effort to butter up the professor, I brought my copy of the book to class today. I only hope Lin-Manuel Miranda is working on this one as well. Ron, it's so fascinating as you read through and you talk about, and the show, the History Channel show, the series talks about him being a misunderstood general, a misunderstood president, someone who's not appreciated by history. I think history probably appreciates him pretty well, as General Petraeus said, as a general, having won the Civil War, defeated the South and Robert E. Lee. But what about as a president? How is he misunderstood and underappreciated there?
Well, I think, Bill, you have to understand that Grant was the first president after the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment that gave them equal rights, and most notably the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. There were states in the South, for instance, Mississippi and Georgia, where blacks actually were the majority of the population, so that if blacks dared to register to vote, they would take political power. And one of the great untold stories of Grant's presidency is that the Justice Department was created under Grant in 1870. And the first great crusade of the Justice Department was to crush the Ku Klux Klan. Grant appointed a crusading attorney general named Amos Ackerman, who brought 3,000 indictments, got 1,000 convictions, and crushed the Klan. The Klan that we know today is from the revival in the 1920s and 1930s. This took tremendous courage. As I was saying to Joe a moment ago, Grant had to do this not only in the face of Southern resistance, but often of Northern resistance as well. Alas, it was a losing battle. At the end of Grant's second term, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president. He pulls federal troops out of the South, and then we begin Jim Crow, which then lasts for 80 or 90 years. But most Americans have no idea that we had a civil rights movement in the 1860s and 1870s. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875 that created desegregation and public accommodations in transport. People don't realize all of this had happened long before the 1960s, and Grant was really the central figure in that.
General Petraeus, it's Mike Barnicle, and I'm looking at General Grant's military career, and it was rather uneven. He suffered desperate loneliness when he was posted out in Fremont, California. He resigns his commission in the early 1850s and comes back to the military in 1860, 1861 at the start of the Civil War. But there's an astounding moment in his military career that I need your help in understanding. The compassion and generosity he showed at the signing of the surrender with Robert E. Lee at the Appomattox Courthouse. How does that happen?
Well, First of all, it happened because Lincoln empowered Grant to a considerable degree to draw up the Articles of Surrender. And then, as Grant describes in his memoirs and as Ron captures so beautifully in his biography, Grant thinks about what the soldiers of the South are going to go back to do and their officers, and allows them to keep their sidearms, their horses. They know that they're going to have the harvest come in. Of course, it's in April of 1865. And he, in a sense, puts himself in, if you will, their shoes. He feels for them. He doesn't feel enormous enmity for them. He does believe the cause was the worst for which man ever fought. But he feels very much for the individuals. And that is what animates what becomes quite, as you described it, a compassionate set of terms of surrender, and sought to foster reconciliation. And of course, that did continue for some time, as Ron described, but ultimately broke down after his presidency.
Grant did not allow his troops to gloat. He didn't allow them to celebrate. In fact, his wife, Julia, suggested that Grant go to Richmond, which had been the capital of the Confederacy, which had now fallen to Union troops. Julia Grant wanted her husband to march into Richmond as a conquering hero. And Grant said to her, Julia, don't you realize how bitter defeat already is for these people? And why do you want me to rub salt into their wounds? And I think the fact that Grant had experienced so much failure in his own life before the Civil War gave him a special sensitivity to the psychology of defeated men and their need for self-respect, and the tremendous tact and sensitivity with which he handled that situation.
The three-night television event, Grant, begins this evening at 9 p.m. Eastern on History. David Petraeus and Ron Chernow, thank you both. Incredible to have you both on. Thank you very much. And we'll be right back with much more Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.